So the sixth of our 8 insights across our country case studies of elections in 2024 was that state and platform cooperation is necessary to address these issues of online toxicity, hate speech, polarization that we've been talking about in the previous videos. And when I say state platform cooperation, this is really around a shared commitment to addressing these issues around the shared democratic principles that we are asking these sites, or we are currently using these kind of platforms and these kind of technologies to take up in our society. And when we look across our 10 country case studies, which encapsulate all sorts of different contexts, including those where there is concerted effort by the state to address these issues, to those where the state is actively utilizing these platforms to put out large amounts of toxicity itself, we saw that in no place this process was working in a way that was sufficient to support the kind of democratic principles that we as a project and many of the states and people that we are talking to uphold. So in instances in which there was concerted effort by the state to work with these platforms to address issues of online toxicity, there's limited buy-in by these platforms doing just the minimum that they can and working with the state rather than around these principles. So when the state changes its priorities, when the government changes to a different government, they may completely change. And then in context in which the state was actively pushing out online toxicity, condoning it, or looking the other way because it benefits the state, there's basically no willingness or incentive for platforms to address that domestically, even when there is buy-in by, say, neighboring states to try to help out and address these issues. And then finally, again, internationally, we saw illiberal international actors utilizing the functions of these platforms to spread toxic and democracy impacting content in foreign states to interfere in their elections in a way that is extremely difficult for the states and the parties being targeted to control. So, Ewan, Germany and the EU is a particularly interesting example of this here because they are probably one of the states that has made the most concerted effort to really work with social media platforms to address online toxicity and other negative effects for democracies, both domestically, but also internationally, specifically thinking here about the EU's efforts to address online toxicity in the Georgian election. So can you tell me a little bit more about these processes and how it's worked and what the effects have been?
So Germany's internet regulation is really based around this idea of cooperation with platforms. So the current regulation in Germany is based on is the enactment of the European Digital Services Act, the DSA, which in Article 9 explicitly sets out the requirement for online platforms to remove content which is illegal in the European Union and within the individual member states. So what this requirement does is it gives law enforcement and security services within the individual countries the ability to approach platforms and ask them to remove content which is unlawful. So in this way, covered within this is anything which constitutes hate speech, directed towards minorities, and so it really works, and disinformation, of course, also. So it really works to try and protect the fundamentals of European democracy. So the aim of the DSA then is to have more transparency in the removal of illegal content alongside other provisions. And what we've seen so far is that platforms have worked to hold to the letter of the law. They're holding the transparency requirements and the reporting requirements to the European Union and member states, but they're not taking the active approach to try and remove illegal content at the pace at which and at the volume at which that we saw before the European election. So in the election in Germany, for example, also France and Italy, Poland as well to a lesser extent, we saw large-scale foreign Russian intervention attempts producing bot networks of thousands of accounts. And we saw that whilst some of these inauthentic accounts were removed, it wasn't at the same scale as they were producing content, which meant a lot of this content got through this control. Nevertheless, this still is setting sort of the gold standard globally for how states and platforms should interact. And I think this will be the main tension going forwards after the European elections in this year, seeing how decisions made by Meta to remove content controls and the content moderation teams and how X's content moderation will then interact with the DSA in Germany and across Europe. If we take this across to Georgia, we have a completely different example, actually, because the Georgian government is in and of itself spreading information which is spreading disinformation and spreading narratives which attack the fundamental rights which are important within Georgian democracy. And so we have in this situation a state which is not willing to engage with a platform, and a platform which then has no incentive to engage in removing content there. So in the Georgian example, we see civil society actually trying to fill the gap of a state which is interested in defending the information space, with civil society actors, media monitors, journalists, writing an open letter to Meta to ask, to lobby for the removal of content specifically that was coming from abroad, coming from Russia. And whilst this did influence Facebook in creating an ad library to show more transparently the advertising and the money that was being spent from abroad, it doesn't have the same impact as when introduced across the whole bloc, like in the European Union. And I think this is the problem that we're seeing in Georgia, is that European actors didn't engage with the Georgian government for obvious reasons to deal with this misinformation. And so there was a gap in this cooperation between states and the platforms themselves in trying to remove mis and disinformation. And what this led to was a Georgian internet, which before the election was, and still to this day, is under constant attack from foreign interests, from Russia, who are trying to influence public opinion, the way people vote, and the perception of the EU and other players. And so I think going forward, new policies introduced by these companies could really decide the directions which these countries go in and the kind of democracy and what happens to democracy in Europe going forwards.
So we just heard from Ewan talking about state and platform cooperation to address online toxicity in the context of Europe, thinking about both Germany and Georgia, where the EU and Germany is working quite hard to work with the platforms, both domestically, but then also in the Georgian context, where the Georgian state is actively spreading online toxicity. So in the Indian election, in the Indian case, we see the government also spreading, or at least condoning, this online toxicity and working with the platforms, unlike the Georgian case, but it seems to be working with the platforms in a way that reinforces this online toxicity. Tell me more about the patterns that we saw here.
So in our reports, we mentioned that states and platforms need to work together to address online toxicity, but we also say they need a shared democratic commitment. And there is an argument that in Modi's India, that democratic commitment is slightly lacking. In terms of the information environment, although we can't attribute it to the BJP or Modi directly, we can see that Meta is quietly tolerant of levels of misinformation, especially targeted at minority groups, than perhaps they would be in other regions. And this was kind of demonstrated by the civil action group ECHO, who created a number of AI-generated political advertisements that included hate speech against Muslims and also violent imagery, submitted these to the Meta advertising board, and quite a number of them were accepted as potential ads. Now, they never disseminated this disinformation themselves, but merely tried to prove in their report that some things that we would consider completely unacceptable at an ethical level nonetheless met the case to be commercially available as a potential digital product on Facebook. So as long as India is Meta's #1 customer base, and so long as the government benefits from the toleration of misinformation, this relationship between the state and the platform that we're looking for will lack the democratic commitment necessary in order for this misinformation to be removed from these platforms.
It's really interesting thinking about this incentive between India as Meta's largest customer base. And it makes me think also of the US, which is also a huge customer base for Meta products, one of the original customer bases. But we also have this added complication in the US of these companies being based in the US and having often like quite a close relationship with the US state, and often seeing them in a way as their like first customer because they're based there. Tell me a little bit about how these processes of state and platform cooperation around producing or dealing with online toxicity have played out in the US.
Yeah, so there's been a relatively storied history of the US government working with platforms that pretty much goes back to 2013 with Ed Snowden's leaks revealing the existence of PRISM, which is a relationship between the largest technology companies and the surveillance state. In 2017, this became a voluntary agreement with the major tech giants. So we're talking Amazon, Apple, Meta, or it was still Facebook at the time, and Twitter. And from then on, there's been loads of examples of the state and platforms working together relatively seamlessly. So in 2018 and in the midterms in 2020, they worked with the government to remove accounts that they believed to be associated with Russia's Internet Research Agency, and they worked relatively effectively with the CDC to counter anti-COVID disinformation. Alongside this, there's been a long-running kind of right-wing argument that any kind of regulation of speech or on social media whatsoever is a violation of American principles, of the freedom of American expression, and fundamentally that all kind of speech should be allowed on these platforms. These platforms are the public sphere, but without any interest in making the social media apps public. So they're a private public sphere, so anything should be able to go on these platforms. And we've seen this become more and more extreme in the tendencies of those individuals. We've seen kind of the cat coming out of the bag when Mark Zuckerberg declares that we're going to get rid of fact checkers on the grounds that we were banning too many right-wing accounts, or we were punishing right-wing political actors too frequently, so therefore it must be unfair. And obviously we have this extreme situation in the incredibly recent inauguration, which at the time of recording is basically finishing up, in which the largest tech billionaires in the world are sat ahead of Trump's cabinet picks as he's sworn into office. I would not be surprised to see a further deregulation and paradoxically integration of these tech companies into the US government. And I can imagine it becoming more and more difficult for the EU not to make completely independent regulatory decisions on these big companies, and possibly deviating from America in the extent to which they're regulated. But as you say, America and India are possibly the two largest and most important customer bases. So as long as they're happy, we might see fewer tweets in Europe in the coming years.